"Move, girl. You're blocking the entrance." The sharp voice of a street vendor startled Claire, who tightened her grip on the half-empty cardboard coffee cup in her hands. She stumbled sideways, her skinny frame barely avoiding the heavy foot traffic surging around her. "Sorry," she muttered, her voice lost in the noise. The small change she had managed to collect jingled faintly, a sound of failure more than triumph. Her stomach growled, loud enough to draw a few judgmental glances. "Useless little beggar," a passerby muttered, shaking his head as he brushed past her. Claire's cheeks burned, but she didn't look up. She was used to the insults by now. 3 months on the streets had hardened her to the sting of strangers' words. Still, as she caught sight of a well-dressed man stepping out of a sleek black car, her fingers tightened around the cup in desperation. He didn't look like the type to stop, but she had to try. "Sir," she called, her voice cracking. "Spare change?" The man froze mid-step. His gray suit fit him like it had been tailored that morning, and the polished leather of his shoes gleamed in the midday sun. His face was blank, his piercing gaze flickering between her and the cup in her hands. For a moment, Claire thought he might snap at her, but instead, he surprised her. "Are you hungry?" His voice was flat, devoid of warmth or judgment. Claire nodded cautiously. She had learned that agreeing too quickly often led to disappointment, or worse. "I could eat." The man studied her a moment longer, then gestured toward the car. "Come with me." Panic surged in Claire's chest. Go with him? A stranger? She took a step back, her instinct screaming against the idea. But then her stomach growled again, and she remembered the freezing night she'd spent under the bridge last week, huddled in the dark with an empty belly. Whatever this man wanted, it couldn't be worse than that. "Where?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To my home," he replied simply, his tone as though the answer were obvious. "You'll eat and you'll work for it." "Work?" Claire narrowed her eyes, clutching the cup tighter. "What kind of work?" "Cleaning," the man said, already turning back toward the car. "You'll clean my house. That's the deal. Take it or leave it." Claire hesitated. Every warning she'd ever heard echoed in her mind, but the thought of food and the rare chance to step into a warm house pushed her forward. "Okay," she said quietly. The man didn't respond. He opened the car door and gestured for her to get in. Claire slid into the plush leather seat, her unease mingling with reluctant relief. She watched as he climbed in beside her and shut the door. The silence was suffocating as the car pulled away from the curb. Claire snuck glances at the man, trying to gauge his intentions. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "What's your name?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Ethan," he said without looking at her. "Ethan Hayes." Claire's eyes widened. The name sounded familiar, though she couldn't place it. It wasn't until they passed a billboard advertising Hayes Enterprises that the realization hit her. This wasn't just a rich guy. This was the Ethan Hayes, one of the wealthiest men in Chicago. Her stomach twisted. What did someone like him want with a street kid like her? The car pulled up to a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. Claire stared, her breath catching. The house was enormous, its grand facade framed by meticulously trimmed hedges and an ornate iron gate. She felt her pulse quicken as the gates swung open, and the car rolled smoothly up the driveway. "Out," Ethan said as the car came to a stop. Claire obeyed, stepping onto the gravel driveway. Her sneakers, worn and full of holes, seemed even more pathetic against the pristine surroundings. Ethan led her to the front door, which opened with a soft click as he pushed it inward. The inside of the mansion was just as intimidating as the outside. Gleaming marble floors stretched out in every direction, and a massive chandelier hung from the high ceiling. But the space felt cold, almost abandoned. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled faintly of neglect. "You'll start here," Ethan said, gesturing vaguely to the entryway. "Mop the floors, dust the furniture. The kitchen's through there." He pointed down a long hallway. "You'll eat after you finish." Claire hesitated, overwhelmed by the enormity of the space. "All of it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "All of it," Ethan confirmed, already walking away. He paused only to glance over his shoulder. "Don't steal anything. If you do, you're out." And with that, he disappeared up the grand staircase, leaving Claire alone in the vast, silent house. She stood there for a moment, her cup still clutched in her hand. Then, with a resigned sigh, she set it down on a nearby table and began to work. The mop felt heavy in her hands as she dragged it across the marble floor. Her arms ached with every movement, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The promise of food and warmth was enough to keep her going, even as doubt crept into her mind. Why had Ethan Hayes brought her here? What did he really want? By the time she reached the end of the hallway, her stomach growled so loudly it echoed off the walls. Claire leaned against the mop, her breath coming in short gasps. She glanced toward the staircase, half expecting Ethan to reappear, but the house remained eerily quiet. Pushing herself upright, she continued cleaning, her thoughts racing. Whatever this was, charity, guilt, or something else entirely, she would take it. She had to. Because if there was one thing she had learned on the streets, it was this: survival came first. Always. The mop bucket sloshed as Claire dragged it across the cold marble floor, her arms screaming in protest. Each stroke of the mop left a streak of dampness that shimmered in the dim light. The house was so quiet that the sound of water dripping from the mop echoed like a ticking clock. Claire felt small in the vastness of the mansion, her movements swallowed by its sheer emptiness. Her stomach twisted in knots of both hunger and unease. She hadn't seen Ethan since he disappeared up the staircase hours ago, leaving her alone in what felt less like a home and more like a forgotten museum. Dust covered nearly every surface, hinting at how little the place was used or cared for. As she worked her way down the hallway, Claire's eyes wandered to the walls. They were lined with photographs, large and framed with ornate gold borders. She paused to study one. A family of 3 standing in front of what appeared to be this very mansion. Ethan was there, but he looked younger, less rigid. Beside him was a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. A boy stood between them, grinning widely, clutching a toy airplane in his small hands. Claire tilted her head, her eyes lingering on the boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The photo radiated a kind of happiness that felt at odds with the suffocating silence of the house. Her mop made a loud thwack as it hit the bucket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She quickly moved on, but as she reached the end of the hall, something caught her attention. A partially open door led to a room filled with dim, golden light. Curious, Claire abandoned the mop and stepped inside. The room was smaller than the rest of the house, but far more vibrant. Shelves crammed with books and toys lined the walls. A bed with blue sheets sat in the corner, its covers neatly tucked. On a desk by the window sat a model airplane, frozen mid-flight on a tiny stand. It was a child's room. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Everything in the room felt untouched, as if whoever lived here had stepped out only moments ago. But the thick layer of dust on the shelves told a different story. She reached out, running a finger over the spine of a book titled Wings of Adventure. The dust clung to her skin like a ghostly reminder of time past. "What are you doing in here?" Ethan's voice sliced through the quiet, sharp and cold. Claire spun around, her heart pounding. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face a mask of anger. His eyes darted from her to the book in her hand, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of something in his expression. Pain, perhaps, or something close to it. I didn't mean to," she stammered, placing the book back on the shelf. The door was open. Ethan stepped into the room, his presence overwhelming in the small space. "This room is off limits," he said firmly, his voice low but brimming with tension. "Do you understand?" Claire nodded, her throat dry. She felt like an intruder, like she'd violated some unspoken rule. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes lingered on the room, on the desk by the window, before he turned abruptly and left. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Claire alone once again. She exhaled shakily, her legs trembling. The warmth of the room suddenly felt oppressive, and she hurried back into the hallway. She grabbed the mop and resumed cleaning, her mind racing with questions. Who was the boy in the photograph? Why did Ethan react so strongly to her being in that room? And why did the house feel so haunted? Hours later, Claire finally finished cleaning the main hall. Her hands were raw and her back ached, but the promise of food kept her moving. She made her way to the kitchen, hoping Ethan hadn't forgotten his end of the deal. The kitchen was surprisingly modest compared to the rest of the mansion, its counters cluttered with mismatched appliances and dishes. Claire spotted a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter on the counter. She hesitated before calling out, "Mr. Hayes?" No answer. Taking the silence as permission, she grabbed the bread and began making herself a sandwich. Her hands shook as she spread the peanut butter, the anticipation of food almost too much to bear. She took a bite and closed her eyes, savoring the taste. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in days. As she finished her meal, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence. "You've done enough for today," he said finally. "There's a guest room upstairs. Use it." Claire blinked in surprise. I can stay here?" Ethan's expression hardened. "Don't read too much into it. You're here to work. That's it." Without waiting for her response, he turned and disappeared back down the hallway. Claire stared after him, her sandwich forgotten. There was something in his tone that made her uneasy, but she couldn't quite place it. She made her way upstairs, her steps hesitant. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with a small bed and a window overlooking the sprawling backyard. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her mind churning with thoughts of the strange man who had brought her here. Who was Ethan Hayes? And what ghosts were hiding in this house? Claire awoke to the muffled sound of voices. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, but as her senses sharpened, she realized the voices were real. Low, tense murmurs coming from downstairs. She sat up in the unfamiliar bed, the faint light of dawn creeping through the curtains. Curiosity gnawed at her. Pulling a tattered hoodie over her thin frame, she tiptoed out of the guest room and down the long corridor. The voices grew louder as she neared the top of the grand staircase. Peering over the banister, she spotted Ethan in the foyer, speaking with a man in a crisp suit. The stranger was gesturing emphatically, his words sharp but indistinct. Claire crept closer, her footsteps silent against the carpeted stairs. "I told you, I'm not selling." Ethan's voice cut through the tension, firm and unyielding. "You can't keep ignoring this, Ethan," the man replied, exasperation lacing his tone. "The lawsuits, the media, this isn't going away. Your board is demanding action." "I don't care what the board demands," Ethan snapped. "Tell them to handle it." The other man threw up his hands. "You can't just bury your head in the sand. This is your company's mess. If you don't address it, someone else will, and you won't like how they do it." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Finally, the man sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." He turned on his heel and left, the heavy front door slamming shut behind him. Ethan stood there for a moment, his shoulders tense, before letting out a long breath and raking a hand through his hair. Claire ducked back into the shadows, her heart pounding. She had no idea what the conversation was about, but it was clear Ethan was under pressure. Something about lawsuits and the media. She wondered if it had anything to do with why the mansion felt so neglected, why Ethan seemed so guarded and bitter. Her stomach growled, breaking her thoughts. She decided it was safe to head to the kitchen and hoped Ethan wouldn't notice her presence. When she arrived, the kitchen was empty. She rummaged through the pantry and found a box of cereal. Pouring a small amount into a bowl, she ate in silence, her thoughts still swirling. The image of Ethan arguing with the suited man lingered in her mind. "You're up early." Claire jumped, nearly spilling the bowl. Ethan stood in the doorway, his piercing gaze locked on her. He was dressed casually, a stark contrast to the formal suit he'd worn the day before. He looked tired, his face lined with shadows that spoke of sleepless nights. I couldn't sleep," Claire stammered, setting the bowl down. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the sink. "When you're done, there's more cleaning to do. The library needs to be dusted." Claire nodded quickly, grateful he didn't ask why she'd been eavesdropping. "Okay, I'll get started." She finished her cereal and made her way to the library, a grand room filled with towering shelves of books. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and wood polish. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, settling on every surface. As she worked, her fingers traced the spines of the books, her curiosity growing. Many were old, their titles embossed in gold lettering. One book caught her attention, a leather-bound volume with no title on the spine. She pulled it off the shelf and opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The handwriting was neat but uneven, as if written by a child. Flipping through the pages, Claire found drawings of airplanes, diagrams of wings, and short paragraphs about aerodynamics. Her eyes widened as she realized what it was, a journal. The name scrawled on the first page confirmed it, Michael Hayes. Michael, the boy from the photograph. Claire's heart sank as she pieced it together. This had been his room, his journal. And judging by the state of the house and the haunted look in Ethan's eyes, something terrible must have happened to him. Put that back. Claire spun around, clutching the journal to her chest. Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression dark. I wasn't, she began, but he cut her off. Put it back, he repeated, his voice cold. Reluctantly, Claire returned the journal to the shelf. Ethan stepped into the room, his presence heavy and intimidating. He glanced at the shelf, his eyes lingering on the journal for a moment before turning back to her. This isn't your business, he said quietly but firmly. Do your work and stay out of things that don't concern you. Claire nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to ask about Michael, about the journal, but she knew better than to push. Ethan's tone left no room for argument. He left without another word, and Claire exhaled shakily. She returned to dusting, her mind racing with questions. Who was Michael? What had happened to him? And why was Ethan so desperate to keep it all buried? As the day wore on, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something much bigger than herself. The mansion, with its dusty corners and locked doors, held secrets. Secrets Ethan seemed determined to keep hidden. But Claire couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity, the need to understand the man who had brought her into his world, even if it meant uncovering things he didn't want her to know. The library felt like it was closing in on Claire as the hours dragged on. The silence of the house was oppressive, interrupted only by the occasional sound of her rag against the wood or her footsteps against the creaking floorboards. She couldn't stop thinking about the journal, the sketches, the neat handwriting. There was something heartbreakingly human about it, the kind of innocence that didn't belong in a house like this anymore. She had questions, too many. But Ethan Hayes wasn't the type of man who would tolerate her curiosity. She was here to work, to clean, and to stay invisible. She had no right to ask about the ghosts that haunted his life. Or did she? The thought nagged at her as she dusted another bookshelf, her movements mechanical. Ethan might be the one who brought her into this house, but she wasn't a servant. She had a life too, a broken, messy one, but it mattered. And right now, she needed answers, if only to figure out what kind of man she was dealing with. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. Later that afternoon, Claire ventured into the kitchen to grab water, only to find Ethan standing by the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, her nerves buzzing. "Mr. Hayes?" she began cautiously. "What is it?" His voice was flat, as always. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the glass of water. "The boy in the photograph. Michael. He was your son, wasn't he?" The air seemed to still. Ethan's hand froze mid-scroll, and his eyes snapped to hers, sharp and unyielding. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice laced with warning, "to stay out of things that don't concern you." Claire swallowed hard, but she didn't back down. "I'm not trying to pry. It's just, this house feels like a graveyard. Like someone pressed pause on everything the day he was gone." Ethan's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else. Pain, maybe, or guilt. He set his phone down slowly, his movements deliberate. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone low but steady. "And you have no right to make assumptions about my life." Claire clenched her fists, anger flaring in her chest. You think I don't know what loss feels like? I've been on my own since I was 10. I've lost people too. I know what it's like to wake up every day and wish things were different. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Claire pressed on, her voice trembling but resolute. I'm not trying to disrespect you, she said, but you brought me here. You could have ignored me on the street, like everyone else does, but you didn't. So if you're going to let me into your house, maybe you could stop acting like I don't exist. For a long moment, Ethan didn't respond. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Claire half expected him to lash out, to throw her back onto the streets. But instead, he sighed and rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of exhaustion evident in his posture. Michael was my son, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He died 3 years ago. Car accident. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Claire's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't say anything. She waited, sensing that there was more. It was raining that day. Ethan continued, his gaze distant. The roads were slick, and I was distracted. I shouldn't have been driving, but I was. And now he's gone. His voice cracked on the last word, and Claire's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his tone. She wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of his confession left her speechless. Ethan straightened abruptly, his expression hardening once more. That's all you need to know. Now get back to work. Claire opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger. It was a wall, impenetrable and unyielding. He had let her see a crack in his armor, but he wasn't ready to let it shatter completely. She nodded silently and left the kitchen, her mind racing. She finally had a piece of the puzzle, but it only raised more questions. How much of Ethan's guilt was tied to Michael's death? And why had he chosen now, of all times, to bring a stranger into his life? As she returned to her chores, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan's story. The mansion, with all its dust and silence, held answers she wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. But one thing was clear. Ethan Hayes was a man running from his past, and whether he liked it or not, she was now part of it. The following days passed in a strange rhythm. Claire kept her head down, focusing on the endless tasks Ethan gave her. Cleaning the library, scrubbing the marble floors, organizing rooms she suspected hadn't been touched in years. Yet, even as she worked, the weight of Ethan's confession lingered in the back of her mind. Michael was his son, his dead son. It explained the haunted look in Ethan's eyes, the dust-coated furniture, the feeling that the house was frozen in time. But Claire knew there was more to the story. There always was. She wanted to ask, to dig deeper, but Ethan's sharp tone and closed-off demeanor made it clear she wouldn't get anything else out of him. Instead, she focused on observing, piecing together the fragments of his life he couldn't hide. The boys' room remained locked now, but the rest of the house was littered with remnants of the past. Family photos, toys tucked into forgotten corners, half-empty bottles of whiskey that hinted at Ethan's late-night escapes. Each clue painted a clearer picture of a man consumed by guilt and regret. Claire understood that feeling all too well. One afternoon, as she was cleaning a room on the second floor, she felt a sharp twinge in her side. Wincing, she set down the vacuum and rolled up her sleeve. The faded scar on her arm stood out against her pale skin, a jagged line that told a story she wished she could forget. She traced it absently, her mind flashing back to the night she got it, the fire, the screams, the unbearable heat. She shook her head, forcing the memories back into the box where she kept them hidden. This wasn't the time for her own ghosts. She had work to do, but as she moved to pick up the vacuum, she heard a voice behind her. "What happened to your arm?" She spun around, startled. Ethan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression wasn't harsh, but it wasn't soft either. It was the look of someone who had noticed something he couldn't ignore. "It's nothing," Claire said quickly, tugging her sleeve back down. Ethan didn't move. "Doesn't look like nothing." Claire hesitated. She wasn't used to people asking questions, especially not people like Ethan. But there was something about his tone, the way he didn't demand answers, that made her pause. "It's from a fire," she said finally, her voice low. "A long time ago." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. How long? I was 10, she said, looking away. Our apartment caught fire in the middle of the night. My parents didn't make it out. She regretted the words as soon as they left her mouth. She didn't want his pity, or anyone's, for that matter. But Ethan didn't react the way she expected. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, as if her story had struck a nerve. Is that why you're on the streets? He asked, his voice quieter now. Claire shrugged, unwilling to admit the truth. The foster system didn't work out. I've been on my own ever since. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire felt the weight of his gaze, but she refused to meet it. She busied herself with adjusting the vacuum, hoping he would drop the subject, but Ethan wasn't done. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his tone laced with something she couldn't quite place. Concern, maybe, or curiosity. Claire finally looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Why would I? It's not like it matters. I'm here to clean, remember? Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a second, she thought he might argue. But instead, he simply nodded and stepped back into the hallway. Dinner's at 7, he said before walking away. Claire stood there for a moment, her chest tight. She wasn't sure what to make of their conversation. Ethan had always been distant, cold even, but there had been something different in his tone just now. Something almost human. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire made her way to the dining room. The table was set with 2 plates, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables waiting for them. Ethan was already seated, his posture stiff as usual. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should sit. Well, he said without looking up. Are you going to eat or not? Claire slipped into the chair across from him, her movements tentative. They ate in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound between them. But as the meal went on, Claire couldn't help but steal glances at Ethan. His face was unreadable, his eyes focused on his plate. Yet, there was something about the way he carried himself that felt different. Softer, maybe. Finally, she couldn't take the silence anymore. Why did you bring me here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I thought I was helping you. Maybe I thought I was helping myself. Claire frowned. Helping yourself? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Let's just say I have a lot to make up for. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Claire wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She recognized that look. It was the same one she saw in the mirror every day. They finished the meal in silence, the unspoken truths between them louder than any conversation could have been. As Claire cleared the plates, she couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in years, she wasn't entirely alone. The days that followed were quiet, yet thick with unspoken tension. Claire kept herself busy with chores, her mind churning with questions she didn't dare ask. Ethan had let down his walls, just slightly, but they were still there, towering and impenetrable. She didn't want to push him, yet she couldn't stop herself from noticing the cracks. It happened late one night. Claire had finished cleaning the kitchen and was heading to her room when she heard the faint clink of glass coming from the living room. Curiosity pulled her closer. She crept down the hallway and peeked around the corner. Ethan was sitting in an armchair, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The soft glow of a nearby lamp cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more tired. On the table beside him lay a photograph, one she recognized from the hallway. The picture of his family. She watched as he picked up the photo, his fingers brushing over the image of the boy, his son. His lips moved, but his voice was too low for her to hear. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't for her. For a moment, Claire considered leaving, retreating to the safety of her room. But something about the raw vulnerability on Ethan's face stopped her. Before she could think better of it, she stepped into the room. Ethan looked up sharply, his expression hardening in an instant. What are you doing? He asked, his voice sharp. Claire froze, her heart pounding. I heard something. I wanted to make sure you were okay. I don't need a babysitter, he snapped, setting the photograph down. Go back to your room. Claire hesitated, then took a tentative step closer. You don't have to pretend all the time, you know? It's okay to miss him. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You think you know me? You think you understand what I've been through? Claire straightened, meeting his glare head-on. I think you're not as different from me as you want to believe. Ethan scoffed and took another sip of his whiskey. You're a kid. You don't know anything. Claire clenched her fists, her anger flaring. I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to blame yourself for things you couldn't control. And I know what it's like to feel like you don't deserve to move on. Ethan's grip on the glass tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I don't know what happened with Michael, Claire continued, her voice softening, but whatever it was, it's eating you alive. And sitting here, drowning in whiskey, isn't going to bring him back. Ethan flinched, his jaw tightening. For a moment, she thought he might yell, might throw her out of the house altogether. But instead, he sighed and leaned back in the chair, his shoulders slumping. You think it's that simple? He asked, his voice low and bitter. You think I can just move on? Claire shook her head. No, but I think you can stop punishing yourself. I think you can try. Ethan didn't respond. He stared at the photograph, his expression unreadable. Claire waited, her heart pounding, unsure if she had crossed a line. Finally, he spoke. Michael loved planes, he said quietly. He wanted to be a pilot. Used to spend hours drawing designs, building models. That's what we were doing that day, coming back from an air show. He was so happy. His voice cracked, and he paused, taking a shaky breath. I should have paid more attention. The rain, the slick roads. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't. And now he's gone. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, but no words felt adequate. Instead, she sat down on the edge of the couch, giving him the space to continue. For a long time, I thought the house would help, Ethan said, his gaze distant, keeping everything the way it was. Like if I didn't touch it, I could freeze time. Keep him here, somehow. But it didn't work, Claire said softly. Ethan shook his head. No, it didn't. Silence settled over them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Claire didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just sat there, letting the weight of Ethan's grief fill the room. After a while, Ethan drained the last of his whiskey and set the glass down. He looked at Claire, his eyes tired but no longer cold. You should get some sleep, he said. Claire nodded and stood. But before she left, she turned back to him. Ethan, you don't have to go through this alone. He didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, crossed his face. It was small, barely there, but Claire saw it. As she made her way back to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Ethan wasn't healed, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she thought he might be willing to try. And maybe, just maybe, she could help him. The next morning, Ethan's mood was different. Claire noticed it immediately when she entered the kitchen. He sat at the table, his usual cup of coffee in hand, but the rigidity in his posture had softened. For the first time since she'd arrived, the house didn't feel quite so heavy. He glanced up as she stepped in. Morning, he said gruffly, his tone lacking its usual edge. Claire blinked. Morning, she replied cautiously, unsure if this was a truce or a temporary reprieve. I need you to help organize the storage room today, he said, taking a sip of his coffee. It's in the basement. A lot of old boxes down there. Just sort through them. Sure, Claire said, though her stomach tightened at the thought of venturing into yet another forgotten corner of the house. Ethan didn't offer any further instructions. He stood, grabbed his keys, and left the house without another word. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the empty halls. Claire lingered in the kitchen for a moment, then made her way to the basement door. The air grew colder as she descended the narrow staircase, the faint smell of mildew tickling her nose. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, some labeled in Ethan's neat handwriting, others left blank. Claire sighed, pulling her sleeves over her hands to protect them from the inevitable layer of dust. She chose a box at random and pried it open. Inside were photo albums, their covers worn and corners bent. She flipped one open, revealing a series of images of a younger Ethan with his wife and son. They were smiling, carefree, their happiness radiating from the pictures. Claire's chest tightened as she turned the pages, each snapshot a reminder of a life that had been ripped away. The next box was filled with toys, action figures, board games, and a remote-controlled airplane. Claire picked up the plane, its bright red wings chipped from use. She could almost hear the laughter of the boy who had once played with it. As she worked her way through the boxes, she came across a folder tucked into the bottom of one. It was thick, its edges frayed, and the word reports was scrawled across the front. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. What she found made her blood run cold. The folder contained documents, diagrams, and news articles about a building fire. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, piecing together the details. Faulty wiring, neglected safety inspections, a lawsuit against Hayes Enterprises for negligence. Her hands shook as she read further. The fire had killed several people, including a couple in their mid-30s. The names listed in the article made her stomach drop. Angela and Robert Hayes. Her parents. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to tilt, and she gripped the edge of the box to steady herself. This couldn't be real. But there it was, in black and white. A direct connection between Ethan's company and the fire that had destroyed her life. Her mind raced. Did Ethan know? Was this why he'd brought her here? To make amends for something he couldn't undo? The sound of the front door slamming upstairs jolted her back to reality. Claire stuffed the papers back into the folder and shoved it into the box, her heart pounding. She couldn't face Ethan, not now. She needed time to think, to process what she just learned. She climbed the stairs slowly, her thoughts a tangled mess. Ethan was in the kitchen, placing grocery bags on the counter. He glanced at her as she entered, his brow furrowing. "You look pale," he said. "Are you okay?" Claire forced a nod, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, just dusty down there." Ethan didn't press further, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he returned to unpacking the bags. Claire excused herself and went to her room, closing the door firmly behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still trembling. The documents had answered some of her questions, but they had raised even more. If Ethan had been involved, directly or indirectly, in the fire, what did that mean for her? For this uneasy connection they had formed? Her mind reeled as she considered her next move. She could confront him, demand answers, or she could leave, walk out of the mansion and never look back. But deep down, she knew she couldn't do either. Not yet. She needed to know the truth. And if Ethan wasn't willing to give it to her, she would find it herself. Claire spent the night tossing and turning, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. By morning, her resolve had hardened. She needed answers, no matter how much she dreaded what she might uncover. She couldn't keep living in this limbo of half-truths and unanswered questions. When she entered the kitchen, Ethan was there as usual, sipping his coffee. He glanced at her briefly but said nothing. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, and Claire decided she couldn't wait any longer. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming through her body. Ethan raised an eyebrow, setting his mug down. "What is it?" Claire hesitated, then took a deep breath. "The fire that killed my parents. It was because of Hayes Enterprises, wasn't it?" Ethan froze. His expression, usually guarded, flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Shock, guilt, maybe even fear. He didn't deny it. The silence stretched between them, loud and unbearable. "Where did you hear that?" he asked finally, his voice low. Claire crossed her arms, forcing herself to stand tall despite the way her knees felt like they might buckle. "I found the reports in the basement. The ones about the lawsuits. The fire that was caused by your company's negligence." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, his hand gripping the edge of the counter. When he opened them again, they were filled with a mix of sorrow and regret. "It's true," he said quietly. "My company, we failed to ensure proper safety measures in that building. And because of that, people died." Claire's chest tightened. Hearing him admit it didn't make it easier. "Including my parents," she said, her voice cracking. Ethan's face fell. "I didn't know," he said softly. Not until now. Claire let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. How could you not know? You're the CEO, aren't you? The one who's supposed to be in charge of everything. Ethan's jaw tightened. You think I don't feel responsible? I do. Every single day. That's why I stepped back from the company after Michael died. I couldn't handle the weight of it anymore. The lawsuits, the media, the guilt. It consumed me. That's not good enough, Claire snapped. You didn't lose everything because of that fire. I did. My parents. My home. My entire life. You think stepping away from your company fixes any of that? Ethan stared at her, his face etched with pain. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I can't undo what happened. If I could, I would. Claire's anger flared hotter. Then why did you bring me here? If you didn't even know who I was, why did you pick me? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his composure cracking. Because I saw a kid who needed help, he said. And I thought, maybe helping you could make up for some of the things I've done. I didn't know it was you, Claire. I swear. Claire's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. You think you can just fix everything by giving me a place to stay? By throwing me scraps and telling me to clean your house? That doesn't change anything. Ethan's shoulders slumped. I know it doesn't, he said quietly, but I don't know how to make it right. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen felt stifling, the air thick with tension and unspoken emotions. Claire turned away, staring out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and confusion. Finally, she broke the silence. I don't want your pity, she said, and I don't want to be your redemption story. If you really want to make things right, you'll stop running from the mess you made and start fixing it. Ethan didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was steady but filled with a quiet determination. You're right, he said. I've been running. From the fire, from Michael, from everything. But maybe it's time I stop. Claire turned to look at him, her anger still simmering but tempered by the hint of sincerity in his voice. What does that even mean? It means, Ethan said, meeting her gaze, that I need to face the people I've hurt, including you. The words hung in the air, a tentative promise. Claire wasn't sure if she believed him, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of something in Ethan Hayes that hadn't been there before. Accountability? Then prove it, she said finally. Show me you mean it. Ethan nodded, a shadow of resolve crossing his face. I will. Claire didn't know if she could trust him, but for now, it was enough. As she left the kitchen, her emotions still raw, she felt a small flicker of hope, a fragile, cautious thing. Maybe Ethan Hayes wasn't beyond redemption, and maybe, just maybe, neither was she. The following days were marked by an unfamiliar tension between Ethan and Claire. Their exchanges were brief, their words careful, but there was a shift in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been brought to light. Ethan didn't retreat as he usually did, and Claire didn't hold back her glances, her questions bubbling just below the surface. It was Ethan who broke the silence. I've been thinking about what you said, he began one evening as they sat across from each other at the dining table. The meal was simple, roasted chicken and vegetables, but the weight of the moment made it taste like cardboard in Claire's mouth. She raised an eyebrow. Which part? The one where I told you to stop running? He smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. That part. And the part about fixing things. Claire set down her fork. And I've made some calls, Ethan continued, leaning back in his chair. To my lawyers, to the families affected by the fire. I'm reopening the case, revisiting the settlements, offering more where it's needed. Her stomach twisted. And what about the people who don't need money, Ethan? What about people like me? Ethan's smirk vanished. I can't bring your parents back, Claire, he said, his voice steady but low. But I can give you something else. A way forward. Claire folded her arms, wary. And what does that mean? I've started a foundation, Ethan said. A place for kids like you, kids who've lost everything because of mistakes like mine. A shelter, education, resources to rebuild their lives. She blinked, stunned. You're serious? Yes, he said. I've already bought the property. Renovations will start next month. Claire didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to call it another act of guilt-driven charity. But the way Ethan spoke, the weight in his tone, made her pause. This wasn't a man looking for redemption. It was a man trying to create something from the ashes of his mistakes. "And where do I fit into all of this?" she asked finally. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Wherever you want to fit. If you want to walk away, I'll understand. But if you want to stay, to help me build this, I'll make sure you have the tools to do it." Claire's chest tightened. She had spent so long surviving, scraping by day after day, that the idea of being part of something bigger felt almost impossible. But the sincerity in Ethan's voice made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could do more than survive. "I need to think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "Take your time." That night, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small window that overlooked the dark expanse of the mansion's backyard. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Did she trust Ethan enough to believe in his plans? Did she even want to be part of them? The truth was, she didn't know. But she did know one thing. She couldn't keep running either. The next morning, she found Ethan in the library, sorting through a pile of papers on the large oak desk. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "I've decided," Claire said, her voice steady. Ethan set down the papers, giving her his full attention. "And?" Claire took a deep breath. "I'll stay. I'll help. But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the kids who need it." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of Ethan's mouth. "Fair enough." Claire stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "But if you screw this up, Ethan, if this is just another way for you to feel better about yourself, I'm out. And I won't look back." Ethan nodded, his face serious. Understood. For the first time, Claire felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. It was a fragile thing, easily broken. But it was there. And for now, it was enough. Over the next week, Ethan and Claire began to work together, their uneasy partnership slowly evolving into something more productive. Ethan showed her the plans for the foundation, the blueprints for the shelter, and the budget he had allocated for its construction. Claire, in turn, offered her own insights, what kids like her would actually need, what would make a real difference. It wasn't easy. They argued, clashed over details, and sometimes retreated to separate corners of the house to cool off. But each time, they came back to the table, determined to make it work. One afternoon, as they sat in the library reviewing the foundation's mission statement, Ethan glanced at Claire and said something that stopped her in her tracks. "You remind me of him," he said softly. Claire looked up, startled. "Of Michael?" Ethan nodded. "He was stubborn, always questioning everything, always pushing me to be better." Claire didn't know how to respond, so she didn't. Instead, she reached for the draft in front of her and handed it to Ethan. "We still need to rewrite this part," she said, her voice steady. Ethan took the paper, his expression unreadable. "We'll get it right," he said. For the first time, Claire believed him. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Claire had ever experienced. The mansion, once silent and oppressive, was now alive with purpose. Contractors came and went, inspecting the mansion and outlining plans for converting parts of it into a temporary shelter, while the foundation's main building was under construction. Meetings with architects, lawyers, and social workers filled Ethan's days, and Claire often found herself in the middle of the chaos, offering input that surprised even her. At first, she felt out of place. These people wore suits and carried expensive leather bags. She wore the same hoodie she'd been living in for months. But they listened to her. Ethan made sure of that. Whenever someone dismissed her as just another kid, Ethan would step in, his tone firm, making it clear that Claire's voice mattered. One afternoon, as they sat in the dining room reviewing a list of potential names for the foundation, Claire set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. "I get that you feel guilty, but it's more than just guilt, isn't it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze fixed on the list of names in front of him. "When Michael died," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "I lost more than just my son. I lost myself. Everything I built, everything I thought mattered. It all felt pointless. I spent years trying to figure out what to do with that, and I got it wrong. A lot. He looked up at her then, his expression raw. But when I saw you on the street that day, something clicked. I realized I'd been wasting my second chance. Michael didn't get one. Your parents didn't get one. But I did. And it's time I used it for something that matters. Claire studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but she found none. She nodded slowly. Okay, she said. But I'm holding you to it. Ethan smiled faintly. I wouldn't expect anything less. The first major breakthrough came when they finalized the Foundation's mission statement. Claire had pushed for it to focus not just on providing shelter, but also on education, therapy, and mentorship, things she wished she'd had after losing her parents. Ethan had been skeptical at first, but as she explained why each piece was important, he listened. And when the final draft was read aloud at a meeting with the Foundation's advisors, Claire felt a strange sense of pride. For the first time, she was building something that could change lives, not just her own, but others like her. Later that evening, Claire found herself in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the small fountain that hadn't worked in years. The sky was a deep indigo, stars flickering faintly above. She had come out here to clear her head, but the sound of footsteps behind her told her she wasn't alone. Ethan approached, hands in his pockets. I thought I might find you out here, he said, stopping a few feet away. Needed some air, Claire replied, not looking at him. It's been a lot. Ethan nodded, sitting on the stone edge of the fountain beside her. For a while, they sat in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. You've done good work, Ethan said eventually. The Foundation wouldn't be where it is without you. Claire glanced at him, surprised. I haven't done that much. You've done more than you think, Ethan said. And you've reminded me why this matters. Claire shifted uncomfortably and used the compliments. I'm just trying to help. You are, Ethan said, his voice steady. And you're helping me more than you realize. Claire didn't know how to respond, so she stayed quiet, her gaze fixed on the faint ripples in the fountain's water. After a moment, Ethan spoke again. Michael would have liked you, he said softly. You remind me of him in so many ways. The way you stand up for what you believe in. The way you don't let people push you around. He was like that too. Claire's chest tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. I'm sorry you lost him, she said. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. It was. But this, the Foundation, the work we're doing, it helps. It doesn't take the pain away, but it gives it purpose. Claire nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. I get that, she said quietly. Giving it purpose. That's why I want to help too. Ethan smiled faintly, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard edges of his face. We'll do it together, he said. For the first time since she had stepped into this house, Claire felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the Foundation, but for herself. Maybe, just maybe, this was her second chance too. The progress on the Foundation moved quickly. Contractors began clearing the neglected rooms of the mansion, replacing worn carpets and dusty furniture with bright, inviting spaces. Claire helped as much as she could, assisting with layouts and making sure every corner of the house felt welcoming. But even as the work brought new energy into the house, Claire couldn't ignore the weight of what remained unresolved. Her connection to the fire, to Ethan's company, still hung between them like an invisible wall. It wasn't something that could be painted over or polished away. It came to a head one evening when a package arrived at the mansion. Ethan opened it in the foyer while Claire watched, curious. Inside were thick stacks of papers, detailed files about the lawsuits surrounding the fire. Ethan flipped through them silently, his face growing darker with every page. What is it? Claire asked, stepping closer. Ethan held up a page, his expression grim. The final report on the fire. My lawyers sent it over. Claire swallowed hard. What does it say? Ethan hesitated before handing her the document. See for yourself. Claire's hands trembled as she took the paper, her eyes scanning the words. The report detailed the cause of the fire. Faulty wiring that hadn't been replaced despite repeated warnings from building inspectors. Hayes Enterprises, which had owned the building through a subsidiary, had been found negligent for failing to approve the repairs. She kept reading until her eyes landed on a single line that felt like a punch to the gut. Fatalities. Angela Hayes, Robert Hayes. Her parents' names stood out in stark, unfeeling text. The room seemed to tilt, and she had to steady herself against the banister. Ethan's voice broke through her daze. "It's worse than I thought," he said quietly. "I knew we'd failed to act, but I didn't know how many people we'd hurt, how many lives we destroyed." Claire set the paper down, her throat tight. "You should have known," she said, her voice shaking. "It was your company. You were supposed to protect people." Ethan flinched but didn't argue. "You're right," he said. "I failed, and there's nothing I can say to make that better." Claire's anger flared. "You think saying I failed is enough? My parents died because of you. I spent years on the streets because of you. Do you even realize what that feels like?" "I do," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "Every single day, I think about the people we failed, about Michael, about you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Claire wanted to yell at him, to make him feel the same pain she'd carried for years. But as she looked at him, at the guilt in his eyes, the weight he carried, she realized he already did. "Trying to make it right doesn't bring them back," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan said, "but it's all I can do now." They stood in silence for a moment, the truth of their shared pain hanging between them. Claire's anger hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, replaced by something more complicated. Understanding, maybe, or the beginnings of forgiveness. Finally, she spoke. "I want to see it." Ethan frowned. "See what?" "The building," Claire said. "Where it happened. I need to see it." Ethan hesitated, but he nodded. "Okay, I'll take you." The next day, they drove to the site. The building had been repaired and repurposed, now housing small businesses and apartments. But as Claire stepped onto the sidewalk, she could still see the faint outline of what had been, the charred edges of her memories superimposed on the shiny new facade. Ethan walked beside her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Neither of them spoke as they approached the entrance. Claire's chest tightened as she imagined the fire, the chaos, the moment her world had shattered. She stopped abruptly, staring at the door. "This is where it started," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember the smoke, the heat, my dad. He was trying to get me out, but the flames." Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes angrily. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Claire said, pulling away. "I need to face it." She stepped closer to the building, her breaths shallow. She thought she would feel anger, but instead, a wave of sadness washed over her. This place had taken everything from her, but it no longer had power over her. It was just a building now, just bricks and mortar. Ethan stayed silent, letting her process. When she finally turned back to him, her expression was resolute. "I can't forget what happened," she said, "but I'm not going to let it define me anymore." Ethan nodded. "Neither will I." On the drive back to the mansion, Claire stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. The visit to the building hadn't brought closure, but it had brought clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future. And for the first time in years, that future felt like something she wanted to fight for. The mansion buzzed with activity as the contractors wrapped up their final renovations. What had once been a cold, lifeless space was now alive with color and energy. The temporary shelter was ready to open its doors, and the main foundation building was well underway downtown. For Claire, the transformation of the house mirrored something inside her, a slow, tentative shift from survival to living. Ethan stood in the newly renovated foyer, staring up at the banner hanging across the wall. The Hayes Foundation. Second chances for those who need them most. His expression was unreadable, but when he noticed Claire standing nearby, he gestured her over. "What do you think?" he asked, nodding toward the banner. Claire crossed her arms, smirking faintly. "It's not bad. Could use a little more color, though." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." She looked around the foyer, taking in the bright walls, the polished floors, and the inviting seating areas arranged for the foundation's first residents. It's hard to believe this is the same place, she said. It actually feels warm now. Ethan's gaze softened. That's the idea. People need to feel like they belong here. Claire nodded, her chest tightening with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. She had spent weeks working alongside Ethan to shape the foundation, and now it was finally happening. The shelter would welcome its first residents tomorrow, kids who, like her, had been left to fend for themselves after tragedy. You ready for this? Ethan asked. Claire hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I think I am. The next morning, Claire stood at the top of the staircase, watching as the first residents arrived. There were kids of all ages, some shy and hesitant, others curious and excited. Volunteers guided them to their rooms, handing out welcome kits and explaining the schedule for meals and activities. One boy caught her attention, a wiry 12-year-old clutching a battered backpack. He reminded her of herself when she first arrived at the mansion. Wary, uncertain, and bracing for disappointment, she made her way downstairs and approached him. Hey, she said, offering a small smile. What's your name? Lucas, he mumbled, his eyes darting around the room. Nice to meet you, Lucas. I'm Claire, she said. You know, I wasn't sure about this place when I got here either. But it's not so bad once you get used to it. Lucas glanced up at her, his expression softening just a little. Really? Really, Claire said. And if you ever need anything, I'm around. Lucas nodded, gripping his backpack tighter, but looking a little less guarded. Claire watched as a volunteer led him toward the dormitory wing, a strange mix of emotions swirling in her chest. She had been where Lucas was, scared, alone, and unsure if she could trust anyone. And now, she was part of creating a place where kids like him could feel safe. That evening, Claire and Ethan stood outside, watching the sun set over the mansion's sprawling backyard. The contractors had finished building a small playground and a garden, and Claire could already picture the kids running around, laughing and playing, a stark contrast to the silence that had once defined the house. You did good today, Ethan said, breaking the quiet. Claire shrugged. It's not just me. This place exists because you decided to stop running. Ethan smiled faintly. And because you pushed me to do better. They fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of their shared journey settling between them. Claire still had questions about her future, what she wanted to do, who she wanted to be, but for the first time, she felt like she had the space to figure it out. You ever think about flying? Ethan asked suddenly, his gaze distant. Flying? Claire frowned. Like planes? Yeah, Ethan said. Michael used to talk about it all the time. It scared the hell out of me, but he loved it. Said it made him feel free. Claire thought about it for a moment, then nodded. I think I get it. Feeling free. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it's time we both figured out how to do that. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The Hayes Foundation was just the beginning, a chance to rewrite her story, to help others rewrite theirs. And as she stood beside Ethan, watching the world change around them, she realized something. Second chances weren't just about making up for the past. They were about building a future worth living for. Together, every second chance starts with a choice. Will you face your past or let it define you? What would you do if you were in Claire's shoes? Let us know in the comments. And don't miss the next stories coming your way. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more powerful journeys.